Hello. As part of our Hyde at Home fundraiser, I thought I'd give this little tour of Hyde House. As I said earlier this week, I usually spend about 60% of my time contracting and installing exhibitions. But with lockdown and the postponement of exhibitions, I finally had some time to delve into the collection, do some research, and think more profoundly about the Hydes, their collecting, and this remarkable collection. We have often said that Hyde House is based upon the Italian Renaissance home. Sometimes we say the Renaissance palazzo, or grand urban house. Renaissance Italy was certainly the inspiration, but in fact we have two distinct Renaissance buildings stuck together, and you see the line of juncture when you look at the western side of the house. Notice how the height of the windows and the building itself change. The front of Hyde House is like a Renaissance urban home. Its public facade is austere and symmetrical. The rooms at ground level are protected by grilles. Here, wooden, but in Florence they would have been made of stout ironwork. The city had a tumultuous history in the 15th and 16th centuries. These lit storage and service rooms. In Hyde House, we have the kitchen and pantry to one side of the entryway and Mr. Hyde's office to the other. As in a Renaissance palazzo, the main receiving room is on the second floor, known in Italian as the Piano Nobile. The original plans for Hyde House identify the main central room along the street facade as the Galleria, where presumably the Hydes intended to display their art collection before it took over the whole house. Because the architect, Henry Forbes Bigelow, intended this room to be a paintings gallery, he prioritized walls over windows. There is only one large exterior window, a corresponding one on the other side of the room, and a skylight that bathes the room in light from above. The family rooms on the ground floor look onto the Hyde's highly prized terrace garden. This half of the house is based on the Italian villa. Leading Florentine families like the Medici had countryside retreats, usually within an easy day's ride of the city. They decamped to their villas in the summer. Villas were attached to farms, so the family could live off the fresh produce. There was an easy access from house to pleasure gardens. In Hyde House, French doors open from the dining room and library. They give the impression that one can easily move from interior to exterior, whereas in reality, the terrain falls away at the back of the house towards the Hudson River. Villa architecture was much more playful and broke the rules than formal urban architecture. We see that here in the stone surround for the courtyard door, with its alternating blocks of smooth and projecting stone. If you step back, you will also notice that a third floor, breaking the building's symmetry, has been added in the southeast corner. Up there was the bedroom suite of Mary Van Ness, Louis and Charlotte's only child. Museum staff and visitors approach the house very differently from the Hydes and their visitors. Without many of us realizing it, we enter and leave through the service corner of the house. Sadly, the kitchen and pantry were swept away in 1988 when this corner of the house was reconfigured to link it to a modern museum wing. We enter roughly at the site of the tradesman's door and pass through the site of the kitchen. Above, on the second floor, we exit via an elevator and modern stairs in an area that once contained servants' bedrooms. We thus experience the house and its most dramatic interior space in quite a different way from that which the architect intended. We now walk the length of the arcade, with a sense of the space opening out and up to our left, whereas the Hyde's visitors went through a succession of controlled spaces. Firstly, they passed through the constricted front entrance into the vestibule. The mirrors augment the sense of space, but then they had to pass through the wrought iron gates into the shallow but broad loggia before stepping down into the sunlit, soaring courtyard. With its peach-coloured walls and trickling Roman fountain, whatever the weather, this courtyard transports you to Tuscany. Over a century later, it remains the most extraordinary space in all of Glens Falls. Now, the family, we know, tended to house hop between Hoop's house to the west and Cunningham to the east. They popped in and out through the garden door. Mr. Hyde's business visitors need not intrude on the family at all. He could step out from his office and meet them in the vestibule. Indeed, when Louis Hyde was alone in Glens Falls running the Finch Prime paper mill, his daughter away at school and his wife buying art in New York, he could keep to the northwest corner of the ground floor, passing from vestibule through his office to his bedroom and bathroom. Access to Mr. Hyde's office and bathroom is not on the public tour, but it is on the special Curator's White Glove Tour, which you can reserve as part of our autumn fundraiser. Visit hyde.givesmart.com to reserve your tour. Donning white curatorial gloves, I will also open some of the pieces of furniture in the house. Look at the gorgeous colourful silk lining in this French provincial 19th century work table. It is almost exactly 5 years since I first came to Hyde House. I had submitted an application for the job of curator and happened to be visiting in the Berkshires, so drove over with family to spy out the place. What struck me first was a certain modesty and reserve in the building and its art collection. Hyde House is not comparable in scale or materials to the contemporaneous Gilded Age summer cottages of Newport, Rhode Island. The paintings here are relatively small, the Rembrandt being the largest the Hydes acquired. They collected primarily portraiture, landscape and genre painting. They eschewed history painting and grand portraiture. I was struck immediately by the omission of imposing 18th century portraits and the aristocratic pretensions of their American industrialist collectors. At the time, I was the curator for the Jesuits in Chicago, so I suspected that the Hydes had been members of a strict Protestant sect, and indeed they were Presbyterians. While I think I was right in suspecting that Calvinism influenced their collecting, I am now beginning to think that their taste also reflected something of the strengths and history of American painting itself. European art was governed by a hierarchy. Religious and history painting was at the summit, then came portraiture, landscape, and finally genre and still lifes. From very early on, think John Singleton Copley and Benjamin West, American artists developed a distinctive school of portraiture. In the early 19th century, Thomas Cole and Asher B. Durand developed an American school of landscape painting. The Peale family in Philadelphia excelled at still lifes. By the mid-19th century, artists like George Caleb Bingham were recording the American way of life in genre painting. But it took the country, both its artists and its patrons, much longer to develop a taste and interest in history painting. The Hydes only bought a handful of paintings that could be classified as history painting. Paolo Veronese's Rebecca at the Well, that hangs above the staircase, is one. Even the religious paintings in the collection, which also constitute history painting, are, because of their size, more like portraits and genre paintings. Our finest old master, Rembrandt's Christ with Folded Arms, is essentially a portrait and hangs in the company of other portraits in the library. So too the small panel that hangs on the door to the music room. Affectionately known as the Angel of Attitude, it is paired with Bartle de Bruyne's portrait of a young lady. Italian scholars have recently contacted us to suggest a new attribution for the angel that we have long attributed to Niccolò di Sesozzo Tegliacci, a Sienese artist active between 1350 and 1363. That attribution was based not so much upon any particular affinity between our angel and others by Sesozzo, but rather by a desire to keep the panel, because of the angel's pose, within the orbit of the famous early 14th century Sienese painters, the Lorenzetti brothers. The crossed arms pose is rather unusual. In combination with the angel's expression, for which there is no other example in Sesozzo's work, the heavenly being conveys a sense of indifference. The angel's pose is actually meant to convey praise and adoration, as can be seen in a Lorenzetti panel now in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It transpires that both the Glens Falls and Philadelphia panels were once owned by Langton Douglas, an expert in Sienese painting and friend of Mrs. Hyde's. Douglas identified Philadelphia's panel as by one of the Lorenzetti and ours by Sesozzo, a Sienese follower of the brothers. The new attribution is to Mello de Gubbio, who worked in Gubbio, a mountain town in Umbria in central Italy. As you can see in this signed altarpiece, the Madonna and Child with Angels, from around 1350, our angels in different expression is a characteristic of Mello's style. Active between 1330 and 1360, Mello may well have been trained by Ambrogio Lorenzetti in Siena. Brother Pietro had worked on the decoration of the great Franciscan church of Assisi, a little further south from Gubbio, and an altarpiece attributed to Pietro hung for centuries in a church near Gubbio. With this new attribution, it is possible to maintain the association through the crossed arms pose to the Lorenzetti, while finally identifying other angels with similar indifferent expressions. The Lorenzetti had themselves been influenced by Siena's great medieval artist Duccio. He was famous for painting the imposing double-sided altarpiece, the Maestà, for Siena Cathedral. Its installation in the Duomo in 1312 had been a great festive occasion. 400 years later, it was dismantled, and some of its smaller panels went missing. I've always suspected that Duccio invented the crossed arms pose, and that the Lorenzetti adopted it from the Maestà for their own use, but that remains only conjecture. In the spring, I was able to make an interesting association between R. Bartle de Bruyne and the famous mismatch between Henry VIII and his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. You may remember the story. Henry VIII fell in love with Anne of Cleves through a portrait by his court painter, Hans Holbein the Younger. In fact, Holbein's portrait only confirmed Henry's infatuation. It was a work by Bartle de Bruyne that first captivated Henry. He had pressed Anne's brother, the Duke of Cleves, to have portraits made of both Anne and her younger sister Amalia, so Henry could consider them for marriage. The Duke commissioned de Bruyne, who lived in neighbouring Cologne and had a lucrative business painting portraits of the city's wealthy merchant families. We can assume that our young lady is from just such a family. She is dressed to impress, with a broad velvet collar to her gown, gold embroidery on her blouse, and small pearls set into her headdress. Her hair is visible but braided. Young girls wore their hair loose, those of marriageable age in braids, and wives hid their hair under their bonnets. A number of her fingers are bedecked with rings, but not her marriage finger. The flower she holds symbolized her virginity and fidelity. I often likened the purpose of this portrait to an image on Tinder. It was meant to catch a man's attention. But there's always the danger that the man only sees what he wants to see. Henry had his own fantasy about Anne of Cleves. According to the historian David Starkey, Henry had fallen for the idea of Anne. She was the right age, or so he thought, she in her mid-20s and he in his late 40s. Her brother, Duke William, carried the epithet the rich, and Henry expected a sizable dowry. Anne had been brought up a traditional Catholic, but her brother and elder sister were aligned with Lutherans, so she brought useful political and religious alliances without herself challenging Henry's own conservatism. If Starkey is right, the marriage plan fell apart when Henry appeared in disguise at Rochester Castle as Anne was making her way to London for the wedding. She didn't play along with Henry's courtly charade. Rather, he saw in her reaction the truth. He was no longer the young fit prince who had wooed Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, but an overweight, middle-aged man about to marry a girl half his age. For political reasons, the wedding went ahead, but Henry quickly divorced her. We have in our portrait of a demure, hopeful young lady a direct link to one of the most cautionary tales about the power of art in Western history. Portraits are hidden in what appears on the surface to be a typical 17th century genre painting. The oyster meal is recognized as one of the finest examples of the work of Jan van Mieris. A Dutch artist of the second half of the 17th century, he was a proponent of a highly refined style of painting, in which the artist concealed his brushstrokes while perfectly rendering the appearance of textiles. Quite the opposite to the freestyle expressive gestures of Frans Hals, or the heavy paint-laden strokes of late Rembrandt. Notice how Van Mieris captures the difference between the white trim fur of the woman's cloak and the smooth sheen of her satin dress. Compare the tight pile of the Turkey carpet covering the table with the plush of the bed curtains. The glints of light on the silver oyster tray are different from those on the swelling body of the earthenware ewer. Hidden in plain sight are two portraits, a self-portrait by Van Mieris and a portrait of his wife Cunera van der Kolk, whom he married in 1657. The painter often included himself and his wife in his genre paintings, as we see in Teasing the Pet from 1660, now in the Mauritshuis Museum in The Hague. Cunera wears the same fur-lined cloak, and the Turkey carpet also reappears. Van Mieris used not only his wife, but also their possessions as props in his paintings. Cunera was his model for the personification of painting itself, in this work now at the J. Paul Getty Museum. Van Mieris's portraits and genre paintings were highly sought after. His primary clientele were the wealthy merchants of Leiden, where he lived and worked. But his fame spread across Europe, and he counted among his ardent collectors Cosimo III, Grand Duke of Tuscany, and Archduke Leopold Wilhelm of Austria. Van Mieris's paintings commanded remarkable prices. At a time when a decent house cost about 1,000 guilders, he sold the Archduke a painting for 2,000, that measures no more than twice the size of the oyster meal. Rembrandt had earned the same amount 20 years before for his commanding group portrait, The Night Watch. Sadly, Van Mieris drank his fortune away. In 1675, his wife wrote to the Grand Duke's agent, asking for part of the payment of a painting to be made to her directly. Otherwise, she feared it would disappear like acid on an etching plate. The artist died in 1681 at the age of 46. Here's a test. Which painting hangs between the Bartel de Bruyne and the Van Mieris? The answer is Landscape near Castle Bentheim by the Dutch landscapist Jacob van Ruysdael. We know that Ruysdael travelled to Bentheim, just across the border in Germany, in 1650. His painting of its medieval castle hangs now at the Moritz House. The Dutch elevated the status of landscape painting in the 17th century. Art historians have long said that their interest in landscape was an expression of Dutch pride and independence, for the Protestant Dutch had fought a long war for independence from Catholic Spain that only officially came to an end in 1648 with the Treaty of Munster. A similar story is told about the beginning of the first American school of landscape painting, the Hudson River School, in the early 19th century. In A Peep into Lake George by James Braid Sword, we see a pristine image of the wilderness as if out of James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans. Modernity intrudes only in the form of a small white dot in the far distance of the lake, a steamboat. In actuality, clear-cut logging had denuded the shores of Lake George and much of the Adirondacks of their old-growth timber. Even the first generation of Hudson River School artists edited out the marring effects of industrialization, particularly in the form of mills built along the banks of northeastern rivers. The paintings were bought by city dwellers to feed a nostalgia for the country's agrarian origins. We know that 19th century industrialists and bankers de-stressed after a day at the office by gazing at their idyllic landscapes and imagining moving through them along tracks and down rivers. Westward expansion sustained the myth of a fertile land given to a chosen people for a new nation, even as industrialization blighted the pristine wilderness back east. When Albert Bierstadt first traveled to Yosemite Valley in 1863, he went by horse and wagon. The landscapes painted following that first trip, including our Yosemite Valley, drew Easterners to experience the majestic Sierra Nevada mountains. By the time of Bierstadt's last trip, he was able to go more comfortably by rail. I know that during lockdown, I escaped the North Country by travelling through the images of global landscapes, the Gobi Desert and Tuscan Hills, that cycled on my computer screen and smart TV. I suspect that armchair escapism was one of the key motivating factors in the Western development of landscape painting from the outset. There is a correlation between its appearance in the background of 15th century paintings and the urbanization of Flemish society. Influential artists like Roger van der Weyden included urban street scenes and terrace gardens in their devotional panels. And we see Roger van der Weyden's direct influence in our own St. Peter Enthroned by an unknown late 15th century artist. Through the arcade is a glimpse of a fanciful city on a hill, perhaps the New Jerusalem, admittance to which is in the control of St. Peter, depicted here holding the keys to the kingdoms of heaven and earth. In the century following our panel's completion, Flanders became the most urbanized part of Europe, and by the time of Jacob van Ruysdael, almost 70% of Dutch citizens lived in urban areas. As people settled increasingly in towns and lived from produce bought in markets rather than produced on their own small holdings, I believe they sought to retain a connection with the land through paintings of a recognizable place. Landscape paintings became a means of maintaining a sense of belonging, of place, and of origin. By the 19th century, as today, such paintings became a means of escape from one's modern, daily urban cares. The Hyde is my daily concern, but also my escape. And I've enjoyed having time to delve into the history of paintings in the collection, think about the Hyde's collecting, and I hope to do more in the future, and that soon we'll be able to have an in-person tour in the house, and you'll be able to examine objects close up and personal. As a visitor to the Hyde, perhaps even as a member, you know what a refuge, a place of wonder and engagement it is in this region. I've enjoyed having time to research the collection and to compile this tour. And if you've enjoyed it, I'd humbly ask you to go online to hyde.givesmart.com and make a donation to support the museum and all that it does, its exhibitions, its educational programs, its infrastructure. Or perhaps you'd like to bid for one of the items in our online auction, which I remind you closes 9 p.m. sharp on Saturday, October 3rd. But I want to thank you for your support. It means a great deal to all of us at the Hyde. Tomorrow is the last day of our special programming. Jenny will be on in the morning at about 10:30 with Art Crawl. And at 6:30 in the evening, Jenny and I will be back to unveil a stunning new addition to the collection. So I hope you can join us then. And again, thank you for your support of the Hyde collection. Be safe and be well.